The coordinates are wrong. The voice came from the back of the lecture hall, quiet but certain, and Dr. Vincent Ashworth stopped mid-sentence. 300 students turned in their seats to find the source of the interruption. What they saw was an old man in a threadbare cardigan the color of oatmeal, orthopedic shoes held together with what appeared to be electrical tape, and white hair that needed cutting 3 months ago. He sat in the last row near the emergency exit, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the projection screen where a declassified map of the Ho Chi Minh Trail glowed in the darkness. Dr. Ashworth adjusted his microphone and smiled the smile he reserved for undergraduate students who asked questions they should have known the answers to. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying the particular condescension of a man who had never been wrong in his own lecture hall. "But did someone from the nursing home wander in looking for the cafeteria?" The students laughed. Of course they laughed. Dr. Ashworth was famous for his wit, infamous for his cruelty, and tenured enough that neither mattered. He gestured toward the old man with an open palm, as if presenting evidence of decline. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is precisely why we verify our sources. Anyone can claim expertise, but real scholarship requires more than a cardigan and a confused expression. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we would love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. And if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and hidden heroes speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten warriors among us." Now let us continue. The old man did not react to the laughter. He did not shrink or redden or look away. His hands remained still in his lap, weathered and scarred, the knuckles swollen with age, but the fingers still precise in their stillness. There was something in his posture that one student near the middle would later describe as military. Not the performative straightness of someone trying to look important, but the unconscious alignment of a body trained to hold itself ready. Dr. Ashworth turned back to his screen, dismissing the interruption with a wave. "Now, as I was explaining before our guest arrived, the extraction routes through Laos were carefully documented by the Studies and Observations Group, though, of course, these operations officially never occurred." He traced a red line on the map with his laser pointer. The primary extraction corridor ran northeast from this position toward the Mekong. The secondary route moved southeast toward the Cambodian border. These coordinates, which were only declassified 18 months ago, represent some of the most sensitive operational intelligence of the entire Vietnam conflict. "The coordinates on your primary route are off by 3 degrees, the old man said. His voice remained quiet, but something in it had changed. A hardness underneath the calm. And the secondary route did not go southeast. It went due south for 4 kilometers before turning east at the ridgeline. There was a reason for that. The reason had a name. It was called the North Vietnamese Artillery Emplacement." Dr. Ashworth's smile flickered. In the front row, Dr. Helen Marchand, visiting historian from the National Archives and the afternoon's honored guest, stopped writing in her notebook. She had been reviewing these same documents for 3 decades. She had processed the declassification herself, and something about what the old man had just said made the hair on her arms stand up. The ridgeline detail was not in any published document. It was not in any declassified file. She knew because she had read every single one. Dr. Ashworth set down his laser pointer. "Well," he said, and his voice had taken on the edge it got when someone challenged his expertise. "Perhaps our guest would like to come down and share his credentials with the class. What unit did you serve with, sir? What years? Or did you perhaps read about these operations in a library book and decide you understood them better than someone with 3 decades of scholarly research?" The old man's hand moved to his chest, touching something beneath the cardigan. The gesture was unconscious, automatic, the way a person might touch a wedding ring or a crucifix. Near the back of the hall, a graduate student named Theo Nakamura adjusted his camera. He was filming the lecture for the university archive, but something told him to zoom in on the old man's face. What he saw there was not confusion. It was not embarrassment. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like grief. "I served," the old man said simply. Dr. Ashworth spread his hands to the audience, playing to them now, feeding on their attention. He served. Well, that settles it then. He served. Perhaps he also walked on the moon and invented the internet. The laughter came again, louder this time, crueler. Dr. Ashworth was performing now, and his students knew their role in the theater of his ego. But not everyone was laughing. Dr. Marchand was staring at the old man's hands, at the burned scars across his knuckles, at the way his fingers had not trembled even once despite the public humiliation. She had interviewed dozens of Vietnam veterans over her career. She knew what those hands looked like. She knew what those scars meant. If you have something to contribute, Dr. Ashworth continued, his voice rising with theatrical generosity, by all means. Come down here. Share your expertise with 300 students who have actually studied this material. Show us all what you know. The invitation was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. The old man would either stay silent and confirm himself a fool, or he would come forward and be dismantled piece by a man who had made a career of dismantling lesser minds. The old man looked down at his hands, at the scars, at the worn gold band on his left ring finger that he had never removed, not even after the funeral, not even after he lost the house, not even after he started sleeping in his car behind the library where it was warm. His wife Miriam had put that ring on his finger 51 years ago, and she had made him promise to come home. He had kept that promise. So many of his brothers had not. He thought about standing. He thought about walking away. He had gotten good at walking away over the past 5 years. Walking away from his son's house. Walking away from the VA office where they lost his paperwork for the 3rd time. Walking away from every offer of help because he did not deserve help. Not when Ronan was dead. Not when 11 names were still tattooed on his forearm beneath this borrowed cardigan. But something held him in place. Maybe it was the arrogance in the professor's voice. Maybe it was the laughter of students who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Or maybe it was the weight of the dog tags against his chest, his own and Ronan's both, warming against his skin like they always did when something important was about to happen. "All right," he said, and slowly he rose from his seat. The cardigan hung loose on his frame, but as he stood, something shifted in his bearing. His shoulders squared. His chin lifted. The confused old man who had wandered in from the cold seemed to disappear, and something else took his place. Something that made Dr. Helen Marchand reach for her phone. Something that made Theo Nakamura grip his camera tighter. Something that made even Dr. Ashworth's smile falter for just a moment before he recovered. The old man began walking toward the front of the lecture hall. What Dr. Ashworth did not know, what none of those 300 students knew, was that the man approaching the podium had drawn the original maps that this lecture was based on. He had drawn them in blood and jungle mud 53 years ago while 11 of his brothers died around him. And by the end of the next 20 minutes, Dr. Vincent Ashworth's career, his certainty, and everything he thought he knew about the Vietnam War would be reduced to ashes. That morning, before the lecture hall, before the laughter, before the professor's voice cut through him like shrapnel, Elias Thornberry had stood at the grave of his wife and told her he was tired. The cemetery was empty at 6 in the morning. Frost clung to the grass in patterns that reminded him of the jungle, of the way mist would settle in the valleys of Laos before the sun burned it away, before the shooting started. He had knelt on the frozen ground, his knees aching against the earth, and he had traced the letters of her name with a finger that would not stop trembling. Miriam Thornberry. Beloved wife and mother. The dates beneath her name spanned 62 years of a life he had been privileged to share, and the 3 years since her death had been the longest of his existence. "I am cold, Miriam," he had whispered to the stone. "I am cold and I am tired, and I do not know how much longer I can do this." The words came out in small clouds of breath that dissipated into nothing. He had been talking to her grave every morning for 3 years. Sometimes he told her about their son Nathan, about the articles he published, the lectures he gave at his university 3 states away. Elias tracked Nathan's career through library computers, reading his papers on Vietnam War history with a pride so fierce it felt like physical pain. Their boy had become a scholar. Their boy had built a life. And Elias had removed himself from that life because he could not bear to be a burden, could not bear to watch Nathan's face as the medical bills consumed everything, could not bear to be the reason his son lost his own home trying to save his father's. The car was parked behind the library where the security guard pretended not to see it. Elias had been sleeping there for 8 months, ever since the shelter waiting list grew too long and the VA lost his paperwork for the 3rd time. The back seat was organized with military precision despite its contents. A sleeping bag rated to 20 degrees, a gift from a church group that asked no questions. 3 cans of soup he would eat cold because lighting a camp stove drew attention. A photograph in a plastic sleeve that he looked at every night before closing his eyes. The photograph showed a young man in fatigues, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of someone who did not yet know what war would take from him. Beside that young man stood 11 others. Ronan Vickers was on his left, arm thrown over Elias's shoulder, teeth white against his sun-darkened face. They had taken that photograph 3 days before Operation Tailwind. 3 days before Ronan died in his arms with blood bubbling between his lips and words that would haunt Elias for the rest of his life. "Tell my wife I tried to come home," Ronan had said. "Tell her I tried." Elias had never delivered that message. He had meant to. For 53 years, he had meant to. But every time he thought about finding Ronan's widow, about looking into eyes that had waited for a man who never returned, the weight of his failure crushed him back into silence. He had been overwatched that night, 200 meters out with a Barrett rifle, watching the team move through the darkness toward the extraction point. He had seen the muzzle flash a half-second before the RPG launched. A half-second. If he had been faster, if his finger had found the trigger sooner, Ronan would have opened that bookshop in Vermont. Ronan would have grown old with his wife. Ronan would have lived. The library had opened at 8, and Elias had shuffled inside with the other early arrivals, the homeless men and women who came for warmth and the students who came for quiet study spaces. He sat in his usual chair near the history section and let the heat sink into his bones. Outside, November had turned the campus into a postcard of autumn colors, students hurrying between buildings with scarves wrapped tight against the wind. Elias watched them through the window and wondered if any of them had ever held a dying friend. He wondered if any of them knew what it cost to carry a memory for half a century. The flyer had caught his eye around noon. Veterans Day Lecture. Dr. Vincent Ashworth presents Shadows in the Jungle, Covert Operations in Southeast Asia. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had not thought about SOG in weeks, had trained himself to push those memories down where they could not reach him. But something about the flyer, about the clinical academic language describing operations that had cost him everything, made his hands curl into fists. He had walked to the lecture hall without making a conscious decision to do so. He had slipped into the back row because old habits died hard, and a soldier always knew his exits. And when the professor had put those coordinates on the screen, when Elias had seen the errors in the map, something inside him had cracked open. Now he walked toward the front of the room with 300 pairs of eyes following his every step. The cardigan hung loose on his frame because he had lost 20 pounds since Miriam's funeral, since food became something he forgot about more often than he remembered. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor with each step. Somewhere in the front row, a young woman was recording on her phone. Somewhere in the middle, the visiting historian was leaning forward with an expression Elias could not quite read. And at the podium, Dr. Vincent Ashworth waited with the satisfied smile of a cat who had cornered something small and helpless. Elias reached the front of the lecture hall and turned to face the audience. The lights were bright after the darkness of the back row, and he had to blink several times before the faces came into focus. So many young faces, so many students who would hear whatever happened next and carry it with them. He thought about Ronan again, about the dreams his friend had shared the night before he died. A bookshop, a wife, a life that never got to happen. The dog tags pressed warm against his chest, and beneath the borrowed cardigan, on his left forearm, 11 names waited in faded ink to be spoken aloud. Dr. Ashworth gestured magnanimously toward the space beside the podium. "The floor is yours," he said, and his voice dripped with theatrical generosity. "Please educate us. Tell us what you know about operations that remained classified for 50 years. Tell us how your service qualifies you to correct a scholar with 30 years of research. Elias said nothing. His hand moved toward his pocket, toward the worn leather wallet that contained everything he had left. The SOG identification card was there, preserved in plastic, the photograph so faded that his own younger face was barely recognizable. The operations brief was there too, folded into quarters, brown stains still visible in the creases where Ronan's blood had soaked through. He had carried these documents across 3 continents and 5 decades. He had never shown them to anyone. His fingers touched the wallet's edge, and he hesitated. Dr. Marchand watched from the front row, her pen frozen above her notebook. She had processed thousands of declassified documents in her career. She had read the official histories and the unofficial ones. She had interviewed survivors of operations that the government still refused to fully acknowledge. And something about this old man, something about the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way his eyes had gone distant for just a moment when the professor mentioned the extraction routes, made her certain she was about to witness something unprecedented. The lecture hall waited in silence. Elias pulled out the wallet and held it in his scarred hands, and the weight of 53 years pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. He had kept these secrets for so long. He had carried them alone for so long. And now, in this room full of strangers, with a cruel man smirking at the podium and young faces staring up at him with mixtures of pity and contempt, he was about to open a door he had kept locked since the jungle, since the blood, since Ronan stopped breathing in his arms and the world went silent around them both. What the professor did not understand, what no one in that room could possibly understand, was that the wallet in the old man's hands contained proof of ghosts. Proof of missions that never happened. Proof of sacrifices that were never acknowledged. And when Elias finally opened it, when the truth came spilling out after half a century of silence, everything in that lecture hall would change forever. Dr. Ashworth's patience had the theatrical quality of a man who knew he was being watched and wanted his audience to appreciate his restraint. He clasped his hands behind his back and tilted his head with exaggerated curiosity as Elias stood motionless at the front of the room, wallet clutched in his weathered fingers. The silence stretched. 300 students shifted in their seats, phones still recording, waiting for the confrontation they had been promised. "We are all waiting with bated breath," Dr. Ashworth said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Please, take your time. I am sure whatever documentation you purchased at an Army surplus store will be absolutely riveting." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the audience. In the front row, Dr. Helen Marchand did not laugh. She was watching the old man's hands, watching the way his thumb traced the edge of the wallet with unconscious precision. She had seen that gesture before. She had seen it in veterans who carried photographs of fallen friends, in widows who touched wedding rings they could not remove, in survivors who held on to physical proof of memories too painful to speak aloud. Whatever was in that wallet, it was not a prop. Elias looked up from the leather in his hands. His eyes moved across the audience, taking in the faces, the phones, the expressions that ranged from amusement to pity to boredom. These children had no idea. They sat in their comfortable seats in their warm lecture hall, and they had no concept of what it meant to low crawl through jungle mud while tracers split the darkness overhead. They did not know what it sounded like when a friend's last breath rattled out of lungs filled with blood. They did not know, and part of him wanted to keep it that way. Part of him wanted to protect them from knowledge that had cost him 53 years of sleep. But Dr. Ashworth was still smiling. Dr. Ashworth was still waiting. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Elias could hear Ronan's voice from a night long ago, from a conversation around a small fire in a jungle that officially did not contain American soldiers. "Someday people need to know what we did here," Ronan had said. "Someday the truth has to matter." "You want credentials?" Elias said quietly. The microphone on the podium caught his voice and carried it through the speakers, and something in his tone made the laughter die. "You want to know what qualifies me to stand here and tell you that your map is wrong?" Dr. Ashworth spread his hands in mock welcome. "By all means, enlighten us." Elias opened the wallet. His fingers moved past the faded photograph of Miriam, past the picture of Nathan as a boy sitting on his shoulders at a 4th of July parade, past the worn edges of receipts and notes he could not bring himself to throw away. He found the plastic sleeve and withdrew it carefully, holding it up to the light so the audience could see the document inside. From her seat in the front row, Dr. Marchand felt her breath catch in her throat. She recognized the format immediately. The seal in the corner. The classification markings that had been standard in 1970. The typography that matched documents she had processed just 18 months ago when the latest round of SOG files were finally declassified. She had seen hundreds of identification cards from that era. She knew exactly what she was looking at. And she knew with absolute certainty that what the old man held in his hand was not a forgery. Dr. Ashworth squinted at the document with theatrical skepticism. He stepped closer, close enough that Elias could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp that clashed with the musty scent of the cardigan. The professor's eyes moved across the identification card, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, quickly buried. "This proves nothing," Dr. Ashworth announced to the audience. "Anyone with access to the internet can find templates for military documents. Anyone with a printer and too much time can create something that looks official." He turned back to Elias with renewed confidence. "What unit did you serve with? What were your dates of service? What operations did you participate in? Surely if you were actually there, you can provide details that go beyond a laminated card." Elias returned the identification to his wallet with the same careful precision. His movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a man who had learned patience in places where impatience got people killed. "I served with the Studies and Observations Group," he said. His voice remained quiet, but the words carried weight. "Military Assistance, Command Vietnam. My operational dates were March 1968 through November 1971. I ran reconnaissance missions across the fence into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam." Dr. Ashworth's eyebrows rose with exaggerated skepticism. "Across the fence. How colorful. And I suppose you have proof of these missions? Mission orders? After-action reports? Anything beyond your word?" Theo Nakamura adjusted his camera angle from the back of the room. He had been filming academic lectures for 2 years, and he had never seen anything like this. The tension between the two men was palpable, electric, building towards something he could not quite identify. He zoomed in on the old man's face and saw no fear there. No embellishment. Only a quiet, terrible patience that made him think of pressure building behind a dam. In the middle section, a student in a Green Beret veteran ball cap had stopped scrolling through his phone. His grandfather had served in Vietnam, had come home with stories he would only tell after too much whiskey, had woken screaming from nightmares until the day he died. The student recognized something in the old man's bearing that his classmates could not see. The way he held himself, the way his eyes constantly tracked movement in his peripheral vision, the way his weight was balanced, even now, even at 78 years old, on the balls of his feet. Dr. Marchand could not stay silent any longer. She rose from her seat, and the movement drew every eye in the room. "Professor Ashworth," she said, and her voice carried the authority of 3 decades at the National Archives. "May I examine that identification card?" Dr. Ashworth's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Dr. Marchand. Though I hardly think we need to waste your expertise on obvious fabrication." Elias held out the wallet toward her. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that the audience could not see. Recognition of a different kind. The recognition of someone who understood what these documents meant, what they had cost, what secrets they contained. Dr. Marchand took the identification card from its plastic sleeve with hands that trembled slightly. She held it up to the light. She examined the seal, the typography, the paper stock that had yellowed with age in a pattern she knew intimately from her work. She turned it over and saw the handwritten authorization code on the back, a code she had seen in exactly 3 other documents in her entire career, all of them buried in classified files that had only been open to researchers in the past 2 years. When she looked up, her face had gone pale. "Where did you get this?" she asked, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Elias met her gaze steadily. It was issued to me, he said, at Camp Longton in March of 1968. The day I became Spectre. Dr. Marchand took a step backward, as if she had been struck. The identification card trembled in her fingers. And in that moment, in the silence that followed the old man's words, the entire dynamic of the lecture hall began to shift. The name Spectre hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Dr. Marchand stood frozen with the identification card in her trembling hands, and Elias watched the recognition move across her face like dawn breaking over a battlefield. She knew. He could see it in her eyes. She had spent 30 years buried in documents that most Americans would never see, and now she was standing 3 feet from a ghost she had only read about in redacted files. Dr. Ashworth cleared his throat with obvious irritation. The attention had shifted away from him, and he did not like it. "Dr. Marchand," he said, his voice sharp with impatience, "surely you're not taking this seriously." "Spectre." He pronounced the word with theatrical disdain. "It sounds like something from a comic book." But Dr. Marchand was not listening. Her eyes had moved to the old man's left arm, to the sleeve of the cardigan that had ridden up slightly when he handed over the wallet. She could see the edge of something beneath the fabric. Dark ink against weathered skin. The beginning of a tattoo that disappeared under the worn wool. Elias saw where she was looking. He knew what she wanted to see. And suddenly he was not in the lecture hall anymore. He was back in the jungle, back in the darkness, back in the moment when everything changed. September 1970. The coordinates were burned into his memory like a brand. 15.7833 degrees north, 107.4833 degrees east. Laos, the place that did not exist, where American soldiers were never sent, where 12 men walked into the green darkness and only one walked out whole. Operation Tailwind. The name still made his chest tight, still made his hands curl into fists, still woke him in the dead of night with Ronan's blood warm on his fingers. They had been inserted by helicopter at 0300, 12 men dropping into a landing zone, so small the rotor wash bent the trees around them. Elias had taken his position 200 meters out, overwatch with a Barrett rifle, eyes pressed to the scope while his brothers moved through the undergrowth below. Ronan was point man. Ronan was always point man. He moved through the jungle like water flowing downhill, silent and sure, and Elias had watched him through the green glow of his night vision with something like awe. The mission was extraction. A CIA asset embedded with a North Vietnamese unit had requested immediate retrieval, and SOG was the only outfit crazy enough to go in after him. They found the asset hiding in a drainage ditch 2 kilometers from the insertion point, shaking so badly he could barely walk. Ronan had slung the man over his shoulders like a sack of rice and started moving toward the extraction coordinates. They were 300 meters from the helicopter when the ambush hit. Elias had seen the muzzle flash. He remembered that with perfect clarity. The bright orange bloom in the darkness, the RPG spiraling toward his brothers, the half-second between seeing and reacting. His finger had found the trigger. His shot had found the enemy soldier. But not fast enough. Never fast enough. The rocket had already left the tube, already screaming through the humid air, already finding Ronan's position with the cruel precision of mathematics and physics and fate. The explosion had thrown Ronan 15 feet. Elias had watched through his scope as his best friend tumbled through the air like a broken doll, as the CIA asset they had come to save was vaporized in a cloud of red mist, as 11 other men opened fire on positions they could barely see. He had abandoned his overwatch without thinking, without orders, sliding down the ridge with his rifle slung across his back and his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the gunfire. Ronan was alive when Elias reached him. Barely. His vest had taken most of the shrapnel, but a piece the size of a quarter had found the gap at his neck, had severed something vital, had turned his breath into a bubbling wheeze. Elias had pressed his hands against the wound and felt Ronan's blood pumping between his fingers, hot and steady and slowing with every heartbeat. "Tell my wife," Ronan had whispered. His eyes were already going glassy, already looking at something Elias could not see. "Tell her I try to come home. I will," Elias had promised. "I will tell her. Just hold on." Extraction is coming. Just hold on. But Ronan had not held on. Ronan had died with his head in Elias's lap, with the jungle exploding around them, with 90 seconds between the first wound and the last breath. And Elias had picked up his friend's body and carried him 3 miles through enemy territory because he could not leave him behind. He had carried Ronan to the extraction point while bullets split the air around his head. He had carried him onto the helicopter while the door gunner lay down suppressing fire. He had carried him all the way back to base, and when they tried to take the body away, Elias had refused to let go until the chaplain came and pried his fingers loose one by one. 11 men died that night. 11 men whose names Elias had tattooed onto his forearm 6 months later, in a parlor in Saigon that asked no questions. The coordinates were there too, the date, and beneath it all, in letters so small you had to look closely to read them, a single word. Spectre, the name the enemy had given him, the name that had followed him through 3 more years of operations, through missions that would remain classified until everyone involved was dead. The name that Dr. Helen Marchand had just spoken aloud in a lecture hall full of students who had no idea what it meant. Elias blinked, and the jungle disappeared. The lecture hall came back into focus. Dr. Marchand was still staring at him with that mixture of shock and recognition. Dr. Ashworth was still standing at the podium with his arms crossed and his patience wearing thin. 300 students were still watching, still recording, still waiting for something to happen. His forearm itched beneath the cardigan. 11 names written in faded ink. 11 brothers who never got to grow old, never got to see their children graduate, never got to sit in lecture halls and learn about wars they had fought in from professors who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Dr. Marchand held out the identification card with hands that were no longer steady. Her voice came out hoarse. "Mr. Thornberry," she said, and the use of his real name seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him. "May I see your arm?" Elias looked at her for a long moment. The request was simple. The answer would change everything. He had kept these secrets for 53 years. He had carried them alone through marriages and funerals and nights, so dark he forgot what morning looked like. And now a stranger was asking him to show the world what he had hidden, to let the light touch scars that had never healed. His hand moved to his sleeve. The lecture hall held its breath, and slowly, carefully, like a man unwrapping a wound that had never stopped bleeding, Elias Thornberry began to roll up his cardigan. The fabric of the cardigan was rough against his fingers as Elias rolled it back, the wool catching on skin that had grown thin with age. He moved slowly, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. 53 years of silence. 53 years of hiding these marks beneath long sleeves and deflected questions and the comfortable anonymity of being nobody. The fabric cleared his wrist, exposing the pale underside of his forearm, and Dr. Marchand leaned closer with an expression that hovered between professional curiosity and something far more personal. The first thing visible was a set of coordinates, numbers etched in faded black ink, the lines slightly blurred from decades of sun and sweat and time. 15.783N1074833. Beneath the coordinates, a date. September 14th, 1970. And beneath the date, arranged in 2 neat columns like names on a memorial wall, 11 words. 11 names. Ronan Vickers, Thomas Harlan, James Okonkwo, Peter Lindquist, Samuel Redhawk, David Chun, Marcus Webb, Anthony Ferrara, William Yazzie, Robert Kowalski, Frederick Hastings. Dr. Marchand's hand flew to her mouth. She made a sound that was not quite a gasp and not quite a sob, something caught between recognition and grief. Those names. She knew those names. She had seen them in a file just 18 months ago, a file stamped with classification markings that had kept it buried for half a century. Operation Tailwind Casualty Report. 11 men killed in action during an extraction mission in Laos. 11 men whose deaths had been attributed to a training accident in South Vietnam because the truth was too sensitive to acknowledge. Dr. Ashworth shifted impatiently at the podium. He could not see the tattoo clearly from where he stood, could not read the names or the numbers that had turned Dr. Marchand's face the color of old paper. "What is this?" he demanded. "Some kind of performance art? A tattoo proves nothing except poor judgment and access to a tattoo parlor." Dr. Marchand turned on him with an intensity that made him take a half step backward. "Those coordinates," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion, "were not declassified until November of last year. They were buried in a file that I personally processed. A file that contained the names of 11 men killed during an operation that the United States government denied ever happened." She pointed at Elias's forearm without looking away from Ashworth. "Those exact names. In that exact order. The order they died." The lecture hall had gone absolutely silent. Even the students who had been recording on their phones had lowered their devices, sensing that something had shifted in the room, that the entertainment they had expected had transformed into something else entirely. In the back row, Theo Nakamura kept his camera steady, his journalist instincts telling him that he was capturing something significant, something that would matter beyond the walls of this building. The student in the green beret cap had risen from his seat without realizing it. His grandfather had told him stories about SOG, about the men who ran missions across the fence into countries where American forces were officially never present. Ghost soldiers, his grandfather had called them. Men who did not exist, fighting a war that was not happening, dying deaths that would never be acknowledged. And now one of those ghosts was standing at the front of a lecture hall, showing the world the names of brothers who had been erased from history. Dr. Ashworth's confidence had begun to crack. He could see the effect the tattoo was having on Dr. Marchand, could see the way the students were looking at the old man with something other than pity. But he had built a career on never being wrong, on never backing down, on dismantling anyone who dared challenge his expertise. He could not stop now. He would not stop now. Anyone could have researched those names, he said, but his voice had lost some of its theatrical certainty. The declassified files are available to the public. Anyone with internet access could have found them and created this elaborate fiction. Elias did not respond to the accusation. He was looking at the names on his arm, his lips moving slightly as if in prayer. Dr. Marchand watched him and felt something break inside her chest. She had spent 30 years studying these operations from the safety of archives and reading rooms. She had never stood face to face with someone who had lived them, someone who had survived them, someone who carried the dead on his skin because there was no other memorial that would acknowledge they had ever existed. "Mr. Thornberry," she said softly. "Elias." She waited until his eyes met hers. "The extraction code for Operation Tailwind. Do you remember it?" The question hung in the air. Dr. Ashworth opened his mouth to object, to point out that extraction codes would not have been included in declassified files, that this was finally a question the old man could not answer. But before he could speak, Elias did. "Crimson Harvest," Elias said. His voice was steady now, the voice of a soldier delivering a report. "Primary extraction at grid reference 489372. Secondary at 491368. Contingency frequency 42.7 MHz. Challenge phrase was "the eagle flies at midnight." Response was "but the owl hunts in silence." Dr. Marchand closed her eyes. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her cheeks. She did not wipe them away. "I have read the Operation Tailwind file 6 times," she said to the silent lecture hall. "I have it memorized. Every detail this man just recited is accurate. The extraction code, the grid references, the radio frequency, the challenge and response phrases." She turned to face Dr. Ashworth directly. "These details were not included in any declassified document. They remain in a separate file that is still classified, a file that I was only able to access because of my security clearance, a file that no member of the public has ever seen." Dr. Ashworth's face had gone slack. His hands gripped the edge of the podium as if he needed it to hold himself upright. The students were no longer laughing. The phones had come back up, recording every word, every expression, every moment of the professor's unraveling certainty. "How?" Ashworth managed to say. How could he possibly know that information if he was not there? Dr. Marchand turned back to Elias. The old man stood straight now, his shoulders squared, his chin lifted. The confused, elderly wanderer who had shuffled into the lecture hall had vanished completely. In his place stood something else. Someone else. A soldier who had been hiding in plain sight for 53 years. Because I was there, Elias said quietly. I was Overwatch, 200 meters out. I watched my brothers die because I was half a second too slow, and I have carried them with me every day since. He touched the names on his forearm with fingers that did not tremble. I cannot save them, he said, but I swore I would never let the world forget them. The silence in the lecture hall had become a living thing. It pressed against the walls and filled the spaces between bodies, heavy with the weight of revelation. 300 students sat motionless in their seats, phones forgotten in their hands, watching the old man at the front of the room with expressions that had shifted from amusement to something approaching awe. Dr. Ashworth had not moved from the podium, his knuckles white where they gripped the wooden edge, his face cycling through emotions he could not seem to control. Dr. Marchand wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that seemed almost unconscious. She had dedicated her professional life to recovering stories like this one, to pulling truth from the bureaucratic machinery that classified inconvenient deaths and erased uncomfortable operations. And now one of those erased men was standing in front of her, breathing, bleeding, carrying 53 years of silence in the lines of his face. You said you were Overwatch, she said, her voice steadier now, but still thick with emotion. 200 meters out. That would make you the team's designated marksman. Elias nodded once. Barrett M82. I could put a round through a playing card at 800 meters in those days. My job was to watch their backs, to eliminate threats before they reached my brothers. He paused, and something flickered across his face. Pain, old and deep and never fully healed. I was supposed to protect them. The student in the green beret cap had moved forward without realizing it, drawn toward the front of the room by something stronger than curiosity. He stopped at the end of his row, one hand gripping the back of a seat, unable to look away from the old man's face. His grandfather had told him about men like this, men who carried guilt like a second skin, men who could not forgive themselves for surviving when others had not. Dr. Ashworth finally found his voice. It came out thin and reedy, stripped of its earlier confidence. This is absurd, he said, but the words lack conviction. Even if everything you say is true, even if you were there, that does not give you the right to interrupt my lecture, to make a spectacle of yourself in front of my students. Elias turned to look at the professor. The movement was slow, deliberate, and something in his eyes made Ashworth take another step backward. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. You were teaching them about the extraction routes, Elias said. You were showing them coordinates on a map and explaining operations you read about in books. But you had the routes wrong. You had the coordinates wrong. And when I tried to correct you, you called me a nursing home escapee. He let the words settle before continuing. I spent 3 years running missions that this country still will not fully acknowledge. I watched 11 of my brothers die in a single night. I carried my best friend's body through 3 miles of jungle while the enemy tried to kill us both. And you stood up here in your expensive suit and your tenure and your certainty, and you told these children that I was a liar. The accusation hung in the air. Dr. Ashworth opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to flushed, the red spreading up from his collar like a tide of shame. Dr. Marchand stepped forward, positioning herself between the two men. She had seen enough confrontations in her career to know when one was about to turn ugly. But she had also seen enough to recognize that Elias was not interested in humiliating his accuser. There was no triumph in his eyes, no satisfaction, only the exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. Mr. Thornberry, she said gently. Elias, you mentioned your call sign earlier. Spectre. She hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. In my research, I came across references to an operative with that designation. The records were fragmentary. Most of the details were redacted, but there were stories. Stories that other SOG veterans told in their debriefs. Stories about a marksman who could move through the jungle like a ghost, who saved more lives than anyone could count, who carried wounded men to safety through impossible conditions. Elias said nothing. His hand had moved back to his chest, to the dog tags that hung beneath his cardigan, and his fingers traced the metal through the fabric. The soldiers who served with this operative, Dr. Marchand, continued. They called him something else, a nickname that was not in any official record. She looked at Elias with an expression that was equal parts scholarly curiosity and human compassion. They called him the one who brings them home. Something shifted in Elias's face, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, but not before the students in the front row saw the moisture gathering in his eyes. 37, he said quietly. The words seemed to cost him something. 37 men I brought home over 3 years. Extractions that went wrong. Ambushes that should have been fatal. I went back for them. Every time. Because that was the job. That was what we did for each other. He looked up at the ceiling, at the fluorescent lights that buzzed softly overhead, at anything that was not the faces staring at him with their mixture of shock and reverence. But I cannot bring them all home, he said. His voice cracked on the last word. 11 names on my arm. 11 brothers I cannot save. And Ronan. He stopped, swallowed hard, forced himself to continue. Ronan died 90 seconds after the RPG hit. 90 seconds. And I have spent 53 years wondering if I could have been faster. If I could have seen the shooter sooner. If I could have saved him the way I saved the others. Dr. Marchand reached out and placed her hand on his arm, on the faded ink of the names he carried. The gesture was gentle, almost maternal, and Elias flinched at the contact before allowing himself to accept it. You carried him 3 miles, she said softly. Through enemy territory. Under fire. You did not leave him behind. No, Elias agreed. His voice was barely a whisper now. I did not leave him, but I could not save him either. And his wife never knew what happened to him. His family never knew. They told her it was a training accident in South Vietnam. They gave her a folded flag and a letter full of lies. And I never found the courage to tell her the truth. The lecture hall was so quiet that the sound of a single student crying in the middle rows was audible to everyone. Phones had been lowered. Recording had stopped. This was no longer entertainment. This was no longer a confrontation. This was something sacred, something private, something that 300 strangers had been allowed to witness only because one old man had finally decided to stop hiding. Dr. Ashworth stood at his podium like a man watching his own execution. His career, his certainty, his carefully constructed expertise lay in ruins around him. And in that moment, watching the tears stream down the old man's weathered face, he finally understood what he had done. He had mocked a hero. He had humiliated a legend. And he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for it. Elias could have stopped there. He could have let the silence speak for itself. Let the weight of his words settle over the lecture hall like snowfall. Let these students carry his story out into the world in fragments and whispers. He could have walked back to his seat in the last row, collected his threadbare dignity, and disappeared into the anonymity that had protected him for 5 years. Part of him wanted exactly that, the part that had learned to be invisible, the part that had convinced himself he did not deserve to be seen. But something held him in place, something stronger than habit, stronger than shame, stronger than the comfortable numbness he had wrapped around himself like a burial shroud. He thought of Miriam, of the way she had looked at him on their wedding day, of the promise she had extracted from him before he shipped out for his first tour. Come home to me, she had said. Whatever happens over there, you come home. And he had kept that promise. He had come home, but somewhere along the way, he had stopped living. He thought of Nathan, his boy, not a boy anymore, but a man grown, a professor like the one standing pale and shaken at the podium, a scholar who had dedicated his career to understanding a war his father had never talked about. Elias had tracked Nathan's publications from library computers, had read his son's words about operations and sacrifices and the hidden costs of conflict. Nathan wrote about these things with the detached precision of an academic, with footnotes and citations and carefully hedged conclusions. He did not know that his father had lived the reality behind the footnotes. He did not know because Elias had never told him. The photograph in his wallet burned against his chest like a coal. Nathan, at 7 years old, sitting on his father's shoulders at a 4th of July parade, waving a small American flag with the pure joy of a child who did not yet understand what flags could cost. Miriam had taken that photograph. Miriam had kept it framed on their mantle for 40 years. And when she died, when the medical bills consumed everything, when Elias sold the house and the furniture and everything they had built together, he had taken only that photograph and the documents that proved who he had been. He had left Nathan a note, for sentences on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad. I love you. I am sorry. Live your life. Do not look for me. He had placed down the kitchen table of his son's house while Nathan was at work, while the guest room where Elias had been staying sat empty and clean, while the weight of being a burden grew heavier than the weight of being alone. He had walked out the front door and kept walking, and he had not stopped until he reached a city where no one knew his name. 5 years. 5 years of sleeping in his car, of eating cold soup from cans, of watching his son's career from a distance like a ghost haunting the edges of a life he had chosen to leave. 5 years of convincing himself that Nathan was better off, that his presence would only bring pain, that the kindest thing he could do was disappear. And now he stood in a lecture hall, surrounded by strangers, with his secrets exposed and his armor stripped away, and he realized that the disappearing had been its own kind of cowardice. Dr. Marchand was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. There was compassion there and professional interest and something else, something that looked almost like recognition of a different kind. Mr. Thornberry, she said softly. Elias, there is something I need to tell you. He looked at her, this woman who had validated his existence with classified knowledge and tears, this stranger who had treated him with more dignity in 10 minutes than he had allowed himself in 5 years. Your son, she said, and the words hit him like a physical blow. Nathan Thornberry. He is a historian. He specializes in Vietnam War operations. Elias nodded slowly. I know, he said. I have read his work. Dr. Marchand's eyes widened slightly. You know who he is? He is my son, Elias said simply. I have been following his career from library computers. I read everything he publishes. I just cannot let him know I'm still alive. The confession hung in the air between them. Somewhere in the middle rows, a student let out a soft sound of disbelief. The tragedy of it was almost too much to process. A father reading his son's academic papers in public libraries, tracking his achievements from the shadows, loving him from a distance too great to cross. Dr. Marchand took a breath. What I'm trying to tell you, she said carefully, is that I know your son. Professionally, we have corresponded about declassified SOG documents. We have discussed the very operations you participated in. She paused, and her next words came out slowly, weighted with significance. He has been searching for you, Elias. For 5 years, he has been searching. He hired private investigators. He contacted veterans organizations. He has never stopped looking. Elias felt something crack inside his chest. A wall he had built brick by brick over 5 years of silence and solitude. Nathan had been looking. Nathan had not given up. Nathan had not accepted the note on the kitchen table as the final word. He does not need me, Elias said, but his voice wavered. He has his career, his life. He does not need a broken old man complicating things. Dr. Marchand shook her head. With respect, she said, that is not your decision to make. She reached into her jacket and withdrew her phone. He is speaking at a conference next month. The same conference I will be attending. I could contact him. I could tell him where to find you. The offer hung in the air like an outstretched hand. Elias stared at the phone in her fingers, at the possibility it represented, at the door it could open into a life he had closed himself off from. The lecture hall had faded around him. Dr. Ashworth and his shattered certainty no longer mattered. The students with their phones and their tears no longer mattered. There was only this moment, this choice, this chance to stop running. He thought of Ronan, of the message he had never delivered, of the wife who had lived her whole life without knowing the truth about how her husband died. He had failed Ronan's family. He had let fear and guilt keep him silent for 53 years. And now he was doing the same thing to his own son. Hiding, disappearing, letting the people who loved him believe he was lost forever. The photograph burned against his chest. Nathan at 7. Nathan waving a flag. Nathan before he knew what flags could cost. "Tell him," Elias said, and his voice broke on the words. "Tell him where to find me. I have been hiding long enough." The moment stretched between them, fragile and infinite, and then Dr. Ashworth's voice shattered it like glass. "This is absurd," he said, and there was something desperate in his tone now, something cornered and thrashing. "Even if this man is who he claims to be, even if he served in these operations, that does not excuse his disruption of my lecture. It does not excuse his arrogance in presuming to correct a scholar with decades of research." He straightened his tie with trembling fingers. "I will not stand here and be lectured by a homeless vagrant who wandered in off the street." The words landed in the silent lecture hall like stones dropped into still water. Homeless, vagrant. The cruelty of them was naked now, stripped of the earlier veneer of academic superiority. Dr. Ashworth had been exposed, and like any wounded animal, he was lashing out at the source of his pain. Elias turned to face him. The movement was slow, controlled, the movement of a man who had learned patience in places where impatience meant death. His eyes met the professor's, and something in that gaze made Ashworth's next words die in his throat. "You want to know about arrogance?" Elias said quietly. His voice carried without effort, filling every corner of the room. "Let me tell you about arrogance, Professor. Arrogance is standing in front of 300 students and teaching them about operations you have never experienced. Arrogance is dismissing the corrections of someone who was there because their appearance does not match your expectations. Arrogance is assuming that expertise can only come wrapped in tenure and expensive clothing." He took a step toward the podium, and Ashworth took an involuntary step back. "I have slept in my car for 8 months," Elias continued. "I have eaten cold soup from cans because heating it draws attention. I have washed my clothes in gas station bathrooms and shaved with water from public fountains. And none of that changes what I did. None of that erases the missions I ran, or the men I saved, or the brothers I buried. The jacket does not make the soldier, Professor. The soldier makes the soldier." Dr. Ashworth's face had gone the color of old concrete. His hands gripped the podium so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "You asked for proof," Elias said. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the wallet again. His fingers found the second document, the one he had not yet shown, the one that had traveled with him through 5 decades and 3 continents. "You asked for something beyond a tattoo and an identification card. You asked for mission orders, for documentation that an actual soldier would have." He unfolded the yellowed paper with hands that remained steady despite everything. The document had been preserved in plastic, protected from the elements that had weathered everything else about him. He held it up so the students in the front rows could see, so the cameras still recording could capture the image, so Dr. Ashworth could understand exactly what he was looking at. Dr. Marchand made a sound that might have been a gasp or might have been a prayer. She recognized the format, the classification stamps, the signatures at the bottom. She had seen documents like this before, but only in the deepest archives, only in files that required 3 separate authorizations to access. "This is an original operations brief for a mission codenamed Tailwind," Elias said. His voice had taken on the cadence of a formal report, precise and measured, and utterly without emotion. It was signed by Colonel Arthur Simons, who commanded SOG operations out of Command and Control North. It contains insertion coordinates, extraction protocols, team composition, and mission objectives. It is dated September 12, 1970, 2 days before 11 of my brothers died. Dr. Ashworth stared at the document. His expertise was military history. He had spent 30 years studying operations and analyzing documents and building a reputation on his ability to distinguish authentic materials for forgeries. And every instinct he had, every skill he had developed, told him that what he was looking at was real. That could be forged, he said, but his voice had lost all conviction. The words were reflex, nothing more. Elias turned the document so the light caught the brown stains in the corner. 2 small holes punctured the paper, entry and exit wounds from a projectile that had passed through decades ago. Then forge the bullet holes, Elias said quietly. Forge the blood. The lecture hall seemed to hold its breath. Dr. Marchand had pressed her hand over her mouth. The student in the green beret cap had tears streaming openly down his face. Theo Nakamura's camera captured everything, every word, every expression, every moment of the professor's unraveling. This blood, Elias continued, belongs to Sergeant First Class Ronan Vickers. He was 24 years old. He had been married for 11 months. He wanted to open a bookshop in Vermont when he got home. He was carrying this document in his vest pocket when the RPG hit because I had given it to him for safekeeping. When I carried his body to the extraction point, I took it back. I have carried it every day since. He looked down at the stained paper in his hands, at the faded brown marks that had once been bright red, at the physical proof of a loss that had never stopped bleeding. I have carried this document for 53 years, he said, and his voice finally cracked. I have carried it because I promised Ronan I would tell his story when the world was ready to hear it. Because his wife deserved to know how he really died. Because 11 families deserved to know that their sons and husbands and brothers were heroes, not training accident statistics. He looked up at Dr. Ashworth, at the man who had mocked him, dismissed him, tried to humiliate him in front of 300 witnesses. You wanted proof, Professor. He held up the blood-stained document. This is my proof. This is Ronan's blood, and I have been waiting 53 years to show it to someone who would understand what it means. The silence that followed was absolute. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a single sound except the soft whir of Theo Nakamura's camera, still recording, still bearing witness to the moment when everything changed. Elias began to speak, and his voice carried through the lecture hall with the precision of a man delivering testimony he had rehearsed in his mind for half a century. September 14th, 1970, he said. Insertion at 0300 hours. Coordinates 15.7833 north, 107.4833 east. Laos. We were never there. The United States had no military presence in Laos. That was the official position. That was the lie we lived inside. He did not look at his notes. He did not need to. The details were carved into his memory deeper than the names tattooed on his arm. 12-man team. Command and Control North. Mission designation Tailwind. Objective was extraction of a CIA asset embedded within North Vietnamese artillery unit. Asset had requested immediate retrieval. Intel suggested his cover was compromised. We were the only team crazy enough to go in after him. Dr. Marchand had taken out a small notebook and was writing furiously, her hand barely keeping pace with the flow of information. Everything he said matched her research. Everything he said filled in gaps that had haunted her for 3 decades. Team composition, Elias continued. Sergeant First Class Ronan Vickers, point man. Staff Sergeant Thomas Harlan, communications. Sergeant James Okonkwo, demolitions. Specialist Peter Lindquist, medic. The names came steady and sure. 11 men cataloged with their roles, their positions, their places in a formation that had walked into the jungle and never walked out whole. And myself, Staff Sergeant Elias Thornberry, designated marksman, call sign Spectre, overwatch position 200 meters from primary team. The student in the green beret cap had moved to the aisle, standing at attention without seeming to realize he was doing it. His grandfather had told him about overwatch positions, about the loneliness of watching your brothers through a scope, about the weight of being the last line of defense. We located the asset at 0347 hours, Elias said. Drainage ditch approximately 2 kilometers northwest of insertion point. He was in bad shape, shaking, could barely walk. Ronan put him over his shoulders, and we started moving toward the extraction coordinates. Primary extraction at grid reference 489372. Helicopter was supposed to be waiting. His voice remained steady, clinical, the voice of a soldier filing a report. But his hands had begun to tremble, just slightly, just enough that those in the front row could see. We were 300 meters from the extraction point when the ambush hit. Enemy had been tracking us since insertion. Now let's get close. Close enough to taste the helicopter fuel on the wind. Then they opened up from 3 positions. He paused. The silence pressed against the walls. I was on a ridge 200 meters out. I had eyes on the whole approach. I saw the muzzle flash from the RPG position before the round was fired. He stopped, swallowed, forced himself to continue. I had a shot. I took it, but the round was already in the air. Half a second. That is how long I was too slow. Half a second, and Ronan took the hit that was meant for the whole team. Dr. Marchand had stopped writing. Her pen hung motionless above the paper, and tears were falling freely now, dropping onto the notebook and blurring the ink. The explosion threw him 15 feet, Elias said. I watched through my scope. I saw him hit the ground. I saw the asset we had come to save disappear in a cloud that used to be a man. And then I abandoned my position. I left my rifle on the ridge, and I ran. His voice cracked on the word ran, and for a moment he could not continue. The lecture hall waited. 300 people barely breathing, phones recording, hearts breaking. I reached him in 90 seconds, Elias said finally. He was alive. Barely. Shrapnel had found the gap in his vest, just below the neck. He was bleeding out. Femoral artery in his leg was severed too. I put my hands on the wounds, and I tried to hold him together. He looked down at his own hands, at the scars and the age spots and the tremor that would not stop. He had 90 seconds, Elias said. 90 seconds between when I reached him and when he stopped breathing. He looked at me the whole time. He knew he was dying. And do you know what he said? The question hung in the air. No one answered. No one could. He said, "Tell my wife I tried to come home." He said, "Tell her I tried." Elias's voice finally broke completely. And then he was gone. And I have never delivered that message. 53 years, and I have never found the courage to look his widow in the eye and tell her how her husband died. The confession tore through the lecture hall like shrapnel. Students were crying openly now. Even Theo Nakamura, still holding his camera steady, had tears streaming down his face. Dr. Ashworth had collapsed into a chair at the edge of the stage, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs. But Elias was not finished. I carried his body 3 miles through enemy territory, he said. The fighting had not stopped. The other teams were engaging from multiple positions. But I was not going to leave him. I carried him to the extraction point. I carried him onto the helicopter. And when we got back to base, I would not let them take him from me until the chaplain came. He touched the dog tags beneath his cardigan, the metal warm against his chest. I have worn his tags next to mine for 53 years, he said quietly. I have visited the wall in Washington and traced his name with my fingers. I have read his letters to his wife, the ones that were returned to his personal effects. And I have never stopped being half a second too slow. I have never stopped being the reason he did not come home. Dr. Marchand rose from her seat and crossed the space between them. She did not ask permission. She simply wrapped her arms around the old soldier and held him while his body shook with 53 years of grief finally released. "Spectre," she whispered against his shoulder. The word was reverence and recognition and absolution all at once. You brought him home. You carried him out. You never left him behind. Elias closed his eyes and let himself be held by a stranger who understood. "But I cannot save him," he whispered back. "I cannot save any of them." In the silence of the lecture hall, 300 hearts broke in unison. The embrace lasted only a moment, but it changed something in the air of the lecture hall. When Dr. Marchand stepped back, Elias stood straighter than he had in years, as if the weight he had been carrying had shifted, redistributed, become something he could finally share. She turned to face the students, her voice thick but steady. "What you have just witnessed," she said, "is a piece of history that has been classified for over 50 years. This man standing before you is not a vagrant. He is not a nursing home escapee." She let the words land, let them sink into the silence. He is Staff Sergeant Elias Thornberry, call sign Spectre, one of the most decorated operatives in the history of Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. The title hung in the air like a medal being pinned to a chest. Students exchanged glances, phones still recording, minds struggling to reconcile the frail figure in the threadbare cardigan with the legend being described. Dr. Marchand continued, her historian's training taking over even as her voice trembled with emotion. SOG operatives ran missions that the United States government denied for decades. They crossed borders that were officially uncrossable. They fought in countries where American troops were never supposed to be. And they did it knowing that if they were captured, their own government would disavow any knowledge of their existence. She gestured toward Elias with a reverence that was almost ceremonial. The operative known as Spectre, she said, is credited with 37 successful extractions under fire. 37 men who came home because this man went back for them. His record includes the longest confirmed overwatch in SOG history. 18 hours in a concealed position, engaging enemy forces, protecting a team that was pinned down in a valley in Cambodia. A valley that officially did not exist during an operation that officially never happened. Elias closed his eyes. He had not thought about Cambodia in years, had trained himself not to think about it. 18 hours lying in the mud with his eye pressed to his scope, picking off enemy soldiers one by one while his brothers fought for their lives below. His shoulder had been dislocated by the third hour. He had popped it back into place himself and kept shooting. By the time extraction came, he had not eaten or slept in nearly 40 hours. He had killed 23 men. He had saved 9. The enemy called him Bong Ma, Dr. Marchand said. Ghost, because he moved through the jungle like smoke. Because he appeared and disappeared without warning. Because men died around him and no one ever saw him coming. She turned to look at Elias, and her next words were spoken directly to him. I have spent 30 years researching SOG operations, she said. I have read thousands of declassified documents. I have interviewed dozens of veterans, and I have never met anyone who served with Spectre who did not speak his name with absolute reverence. You are not a footnote in history, Elias. You are the history that footnotes are written about. The student in the green beret cap stepped forward from the aisle. His voice shook when he spoke, but he spoke anyway. My grandfather served in Vietnam, he said. He was with MACV. He came home in 1971 with a Silver Star and nightmares that lasted until he died. The student's hands were trembling at his sides. He used to tell me stories about the ghost soldiers, the men who ran missions across the fence. He said they were the bravest men he ever knew. He said most of them never got recognized because their missions never officially happened. He looked at Elias with an expression that was equal parts grief and gratitude. He told me once about a marksman. The student continued. A marksman who held a position for almost a full day while a team was trapped in a valley. My grandfather was on the extraction helicopter. He said when they finally pulled the marksman out, he could barely stand. He said the man had been shot twice and had not stopped fighting. The student's voice broke. My grandfather said that marksman saved 9 men that day. He said he wished he could have thanked him. Elias looked at the young man, at the cap on his head, at the tears on his face, at the trembling hands that marked him as his grandfather's grandson. What was your grandfather's name? Elias asked quietly. Corporal Daniel Whitmore, the student said. He died 3 years ago. The name hit Elias like a physical blow. Daniel Whitmore. Danny. The kid from Ohio who had been so scared during the extraction that he had vomited over the side of the helicopter. The kid who had gripped Elias's hand during the flight back to base and whispered thank you over and over until the medics pulled them apart. I remember him, Elias said, and his voice was barely audible. He had red hair, freckles. He was 20 years old, and he should not have been there. None of US should have been there. The student made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. That is him. That is my grandfather. Elias crossed the space between them with steps that seemed to cost him everything he had left. He stood before the young man, this grandson of a soldier he had saved 53 years ago, and he did something he had not done since the day he left the service. He saluted. The gesture was crisp despite his age, precise despite the trembling in his arm, perfect despite the decades since he had last performed it. And then his hand came down, and he pulled the young man into an embrace. "Your grandfather was brave," Elias said against the student's shoulder. "He was scared out of his mind, but he was brave. And he made a home. He had a life. He had a family. He had you." He pulled back and looked into the young man's eyes. "That is why we did what we did," Elias said. "Not for medals, not for recognition, for the men who came home, for the lives they got to live, for the grandchildren they got to raise." The lecture hall had become something else entirely. Not a classroom, not a confrontation, something sacred, something holy. 300 people bearing witness to a reunion that spanned half a century and 2 generations. Dr. Ashworth had not moved from his chair. His face was buried in his hands, and his shoulders shook with the weight of what he had done, what he had said, what he had failed to see. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed expertise lay in ruins around him. But somehow that did not seem to matter anymore. Somehow nothing mattered except the old soldier embracing the grandson of man he had saved in a valley that never existed. And in that moment, watching through cameras and tear-blurred eyes, 300 students understood something that no textbook could ever teach them. That history was not just dates and coordinates and declassified documents. History was blood and sacrifice and men who carried each other through the darkness. History was standing in front of you in a threadbare cardigan, asking only to be remembered. The embrace between Elias and the young man ended. But something had been sealed between them, a connection that would outlast this moment, this room, this day. The student stepped back and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "My grandfather would have wanted to be here," he said. "He would have wanted to thank you himself." Elias shook his head slowly. "He does not owe me thanks. None of them do. I was just doing my job." From across the room, a new voice cut through the silence. It was Dr. Ashworth. He had risen from his chair, and his face was ravaged, stripped of all the arrogance and certainty that had defined him. His hands hung limp at his sides, and when he spoke, his voice cracked like dry wood. "Mr. Thornberry," he said. The name came out rough, broken. "Elias, I do not know how to say what I need to say." He took a step forward, then stopped, as if unsure whether he had the right to approach. "I have spent 30 years building a career on expertise I thought I had earned," Ashworth continued. "I have stood in front of thousands of students and taught them about wars I never fought, about sacrifices I never made, about operations I only understood through documents and footnotes." He swallowed hard. "And today, I stood in front of 300 of those students and mocked a man who lived the history I only read about." The confession hung in the air. Students watched in stunned silence as their professor, the man who had never been wrong, who had never backed down, who had dismantled lesser minds with surgical precision, crumbled before their eyes. "I called you a vagrant," Ashworth said, and his voice broke on the word. "I accused you of stolen valor. I threatened to have you removed from my lecture hall. And the whole time, you stood there with more dignity than I have ever possessed, carrying wounds I cannot begin to understand." He took another step forward, close enough now that Elias could see the tears tracking down his face. "I am sorry," Ashworth said. The words came out strangled, inadequate, the best he could offer. "I am so sorry. I do not expect your forgiveness. I do not deserve it. But I need you to know that I will spend the rest of my career trying to make this right." Elias studied the man before him. The expensive suit that now seemed like a costume. The tenure that suddenly meant nothing. The certainty that had crumbled into dust. He had seen men break before. He had seen them break in jungles and hospitals and VA offices where the paperwork was always lost. But he had never expected to see it in a lecture hall, in a professor who had everything the world said mattered. "You wanted to protect your expertise," Elias said quietly. "You saw someone who threatened what you had built, and you struck first. I understand that. I have seen men do worse for less." Ashworth shook his head. "That does not excuse what I did." "No," Elias agreed. "It is not, but it explains it. An explanation is the first step toward understanding." He reached out and placed a hand on the professor's shoulder. The gesture was unexpected, and Ashworth flinched as if he had been struck. "I did not come here today to humiliate you," Elias said. "I came here because I was cold and the lecture hall was warm. I spoke up because you had the coordinates wrong, and those coordinates matter to me. They are where my brothers died." He let the words settle. "But I do not want your career destroyed over this. I want something else." Ashworth looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "What?" "Anything." Elias turned to face the students, the 300 young faces that had witnessed everything. "I want you to teach them the truth," he said. "Not just the dates and the coordinates and the declassified documents. The real truth. That history is not something that happened to other people in other times. History is happening right now, in this room between us." He gestured toward his own chest, toward the dog tags hidden beneath the cardigan. "History is carried by people who were there, and if you want to understand it, you have to listen to them before they are gone." Dr. Marchand stepped forward, her phone still in her hand. "I have a proposal," she said. Her voice had regained its professional steadiness, though her eyes were still bright with tears. "Mr. Thornberry's testimony today is exactly the kind of primary source material that historians dream of accessing. If he is willing, I would like to formally record his account for the National Archives. A complete oral history of his service, his operations, his experiences." She looked at Elias with an expression that was equal parts request and reverence. "Your story deserves to be preserved," she said, "not just for scholars, for the families who never knew what really happened to their loved ones, for the country that asked you to serve in silence, for the 11 men whose names you carry on your arm." Elias felt something shift in his chest. For 53 years, he had kept these secrets. For 53 years, he had carried the weight alone. And now a stranger was offering to help him set it down, to transform his burden into a gift for future generations. Before he could answer, Theo Nakamura approached from the back of the room. The young graduate student still held his camera, but his face was transformed, lit with purpose. "Sir," he said, "the video I recorded today has already been shared with the university media department. They want to know if they can release it publicly." He hesitated. "I think the world needs to see this. I think people need to know that heroes do not always look like what we expect." Elias looked around the lecture hall, at the students with their phones and their tears, at the professor on his knees seeking forgiveness, at the historian offering to preserve his story, at the grandson of man he had saved half a century ago, at all these strangers who had become witnesses to his truth. He thought of Ronan, of the message he had never delivered, of the 53 years of silence that had protected no one and healed nothing. "Yes," he said finally. His voice was quiet but certain. "Record it. Preserve it. Share it. I am done hiding." Dr. Marchand smiled through her tears. "And your son, Nathan? May I contact him?" The question hit him like it had before, but this time he did not flinch. This time he let it land, let it settle, let it become part of the new reality he was building. "Yes," he said. "Tell him where to find me. Tell him I am ready to come home." The lecture hall erupted, not in applause, though that would come later, but in something deeper, something that sounded like 300 people exhaling at once, releasing tension they had not known they were holding, making room for hope they had not known they needed. 1 week later, Elias sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the university. The same coffee shop where he had sometimes sat by the window to warm his hand around a cup he could not afford, nursing it for hours until the staff began to give him looks. But today was different. Today he had money in his pocket, donated by students who had passed a hat around the lecture hall before he could stop them. Today he wore a clean shirt, pressed and folded by Dr. Marchand herself, who had insisted he could not meet his son looking like he had slept in his car, which he had. But that was going to change too. The video had gone viral within 48 hours. 14 million views and climbing. Comments from veterans around the world, sharing their own stories, thanking Elias for his service, asking how they could help. News outlets had picked up the story. Journalists had requested interviews. A publisher had reached out about a book. The world, it seemed, was hungry for exactly what Elias had been hiding for 53 years. He had done 3 interviews already. Short ones. Careful ones. Dr. Marchand had coached him on what to say and what to hold back, how to honor his brothers without compromising operations that were still technically classified. She had also begun the formal oral history process, spending hours with him in a quiet room at the National Archives Annex, recording every detail he could remember about every mission he had run. It was exhausting. It was healing. It was the first time in his life he had spoken these truths aloud to someone who understood their weight. Dr. Ashworth had resigned from his position the day after the lecture. Not because the university had asked him to, though they had been considering it. Because he could not stand in front of another classroom knowing what he had done. He had sent Elias a letter, handwritten on university stationery, apologizing again and offering to help in any way he could. Elias had written back. A short note. 4 sentences. I accept your apology. I hope you find peace. The truth is not your enemy. Let it teach you. The coffee shop door opened, and Elias looked up. Nathan stood in the entrance. 52 years old, gray at the temples, glasses that made him look like the professor he was. He wore a coat that was too thin for the weather and carried a briefcase that was too heavy for his frame, and he stood frozen in the doorway, as if he had forgotten how to walk. Elias rose from his seat. His legs felt unsteady beneath him. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. 5 years. 5 years since he had seen his son's face in person. 5 years since he had walked out of Nathan's guest room and kept walking until he disappeared. Nathan crossed the coffee shop in 6 steps. He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply wrapped his arms around his father and held on like a man drowning, like a child lost, like a son who had finally found what he had been searching for. I am sorry, Elias whispered against his son's shoulder. I am so sorry I left. I am so sorry I made you look for me. I thought I was protecting you. I thought you were better off without me. Nathan pulled back just enough to look into his father's eyes. His face was wet with tears, but he was smiling. The smile Miriam used to smile. The smile Elias had fallen in love with 60 years ago. You are an idiot, Nathan said, and there was so much love in the words that they did not sting at all. I have been looking for you for 5 years. I have hired investigators. I have contacted every veterans organization in the country. I have read every police report about elderly men found deceased and prayed it was not you. He gripped his father's shoulders with hands that trembled. I thought you were dead, Nathan said. I thought I was never going to see you again. And the whole time you were 3 states away, sleeping in your car, reading my articles in public libraries. Elias nodded. He could not deny it, could not explain it in a way that made sense. The guilt that had driven him away seemed small now, insignificant against the grief he had caused by leaving. I read everything you wrote, he said. Every article, every paper, every footnote. I was so proud of you. I am so proud of you. He reached up and touched his son's face, the face that looked so much like Miriam's, the face he had denied himself for 5 years. You became exactly who your mother and I dreamed you would become, and I could not let myself be a burden on that. Nathan shook his head fiercely. You were never a burden. You are my father. You are my father, and I do not care if you need help. I do not care if you need money or a place to live or someone to drive you to doctor's appointments. I care that you are alive. I care that you are here. I care that I finally get to bring you home. Home. The word broke something open in Elias's chest. He had not had a home in 5 years, had not believed he deserved one, but his son was standing in front of him, offering exactly that, and for the first time since Miriam died, Elias let himself believe that maybe he did. They sat together in the coffee shop for 3 hours. Elias told Nathan everything, the operations he had never spoken about, the brothers he had lost, the guilt he had carried for 53 years over a half-second that had cost Ronan his life. Nathan listened without judgment, without interruption, with the patience of a historian trained to receive testimony and the love of a son who had finally found his father. When Elias told him about Ronan's widow, about the message he had never delivered, Nathan made a decision on the spot. We will find her together, he said. We will tell her the truth together. You do not have to do this alone anymore. 6 months later, Elias stood in a small cemetery in Vermont. Nathan was beside him. Dr. Marchand had come too, along with the grandson of Daniel Whitmore, who had become something like family in the months since the lecture hall. They stood in a semicircle around a headstone that bore Ronan's name, and Elias finally delivered the message he had carried for 53 years. Ronan's widow was 81 years old. She had remarried eventually, had children, had grandchildren. But she had never forgotten her first husband, the young man who had shipped off to a war he did not come back from. When Elias told her the truth, when he described how Ronan had died protecting his team, how he had asked only that his wife know he tried to come home, she had wept. But she had also thanked him for carrying the truth all these years, thanked him for finally setting it free. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in forms we do not always recognize, please subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who carries their service in silence, asking nothing, deserving everything? Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is not charge into enemy fire. Sometimes the bravest thing is to finally stop running and let the people who love him bring him home. Thank you for watching. Elias visits the university every month now. He sits in on Dr. Ashworth's replacement, a young professor who teaches military history with humility and hunger to learn. Sometimes Elias speaks to the class. Sometimes he just listens. But he is never invisible anymore. He is never cold. And when he visits Miriam's grave now, he does not tell her he is tired. He tells her he is home. He tells her Nathan is well. He tells her the truth finally came out, and it set him free. Still here, brother, he whispers to Ronan sometimes, when the nights are quiet and the memories are close. Still trying. And I finally stopped running. The names on his arm have not faded. 11 brothers, carried in ink and memory. But they're no longer a weight he bears alone. They are a testament, a memorial, a promise kept. And every time a student asks about them, every time a stranger notices the tattoo and wonders what it means, Elias tells them the truth. These are my brothers, he says. They died so others could live. And as long as I am breathing, they will never be forgotten.